For 5,000 years, the circle of stones has sat quietly on a windswept plain in southern England, refusing to fully explain itself. Millions of people have walked around it. Hundreds of researchers have spent entire careers studying it. And yet, until shockingly recently, we still did not even know where all of its stones actually came from. Then, in the last couple of years, something changed. Researchers began feeding the full weight of everything ever recorded about Stonehenge, every excavation report, every mineral analysis, every astronomical calculation collected over 3 centuries into GROK, an advanced AI system built to find patterns across massive datasets. What came back did not just confirm old assumptions, it forced experts to rewrite basic facts about the monument that had stood unquestioned for over 100 years. Let's start with what we know for certain, because even the confirmed facts about Stonehenge are more remarkable than most people realize. Construction began around 5,000 years ago, during the late Neolithic period, and it did not happen all at once. Archaeologists now understand Stonehenge as a monument built in stages, spanning well over 1,000 years of continuous modification. The first phase was little more than a circular ditch and bank, dug using tools made from antler and bone. Only later did the massive stones we recognize today get added, moved, rearranged, and in some cases removed entirely and repositioned somewhere else on the site. Excavation at Stonehenge has actually been happening for an extraordinarily long time. Records show antiquarians were already digging around the site as far back as the early 17th century, decades before most of modern science even existed. Over the following 300 years, an enormous list of investigators worked the site, from architects to mining engineers to, famously, even Charles Darwin himself, who was given permission to dig a small test excavation in order to study how earthworms gradually bury structures over time. Each of these investigations, spread across centuries, left behind its own set of notes, drawings, and physical samples, many of which sat quietly in storage for generations, before anyone applied modern testing methods to them. The stones themselves fall into distinct categories, and each category tells its own story. The largest stones, known as sarsens, are enormous sandstone blocks, some weighing over 20 tons. For decades, researchers believed these came from somewhere relatively close by. Recent analysis narrowed that origin down to the Marlborough Downs, roughly 15 miles from the site itself. Moving stones of that size across even 15 miles using nothing but timber, rope, and raw human labor remains an engineering feat that modern experts still struggle to fully reconstruct. Then there are the smaller stones, commonly called bluestones. These came from much further away, roughly 180 miles, all the way from the Preseli Hills in West Wales. For nearly a century, this fact alone stood as one of the most astonishing details in all of British archaeology. Transporting multi-ton stones across 180 miles of ancient, largely unmapped terrain without wheels, without draft animals, suited for the job, represents a logistical undertaking almost impossible to overstate. The bluestones themselves are actually the earliest large stones placed at the site, arriving before the massive sarsens were ever brought in. Their bluish tint, visible when the stone is wet or freshly cut, gave them their name, and for generations, some researchers speculated they may have been chosen specifically for that unusual coloring, or even for supposed acoustic or healing properties associated with certain rock formations in the region they came from. Whatever the exact reason, the deliberate choice to haul these particular stones across such an enormous distance, when plenty of usable stone existed far closer to the construction site, tells us the selection was never about convenience. It was about something else entirely, something intentional enough to justify one of the most demanding transportation efforts in the entire prehistoric world. But the biggest shock did not come from the sarsens, and it did not come from the bluestones. It came from a single stone sitting flat at the very center of the monument, a stone researchers had called the altar stone for over 100 years. Before we go further, if deep dives into real archaeological mysteries are your thing, go ahead and subscribe now, because this channel exists specifically to chase stories like this one all the way to the end. For more than 100 years, the scientific consensus held that the altar stone, like the smaller bluestones surrounding it, originated in Wales. It made sense geographically. It made sense given how close the altar stone sits to the bluestone arrangement inside the monument. Nobody seriously questioned this assumption for generations. Then, in 2024, a team of geologists led by researchers at Curtin University in Australia decided to actually test that assumption directly, using precise mineral dating techniques on tiny fragments of the stone collected from excavations dating as far back as the 1840s. What they found stunned everyone involved. The mineral composition of the altar stone did not match Wales at all. Instead, specific mineral grains inside the stone dated back, somewhere between 1 billion and 2 billion years, while other minerals inside the same sample dated to around 450 million years old. That precise geological fingerprint pointed to one place, and one place only, a region in northeastern Scotland known as the Orcadian Basin, an area that includes the tip of the Scottish mainland along with the Orkney Islands. The altar stone had not traveled 180 miles from Wales. It had traveled at least 750 kilometers, more than 460 miles from Scotland. One of the lead researchers on the study admitted the team could hardly believe the result themselves. No other stone monument from that entire time period, anywhere in the world, is known to have used material transported across a distance anywhere close to that scale. What makes this even more remarkable is how the researchers actually confirmed it. They were not permitted to chip fresh samples directly from the altar stone itself, since it remains a protected part of an active heritage site. Instead, they had to rely on tiny rock fragments collected during excavations, conducted as far back as the 1840s, fragments that had simply been sitting in storage for well over a century, waiting for someone with the right tools to finally test them properly. That detail alone says something important about how much hidden potential still exists inside old archaeological collections, sitting quietly in boxes, waiting for new technology to finally ask the right questions. The single discovery did more than just update a museum placard. It fundamentally changed how archaeologists have to think about Neolithic Britain as a whole. If a 6-ton slab of sandstone made a journey of over 400 miles, whether hauled overland or floated by sea along the coastline, that implies a level of long-distance cooperation, navigation, and coordinated labor that nobody expected from people living 5,000 years ago. It suggests networks of contact and trade stretching across the entire length of the British Isles, connecting communities in Scotland, Wales, and southern England in ways researchers previously assumed were far too primitive and disconnected to exist. Archaeologists studying the broader late Neolithic period have started pointing to other supporting evidence for exactly this kind of long-distance connection. Similar pottery styles and comparable house-building designs have been identified at sites separated by hundreds of miles across the British Isles during roughly the same time period Stonehenge was under construction. On their own, shared pottery styles might just suggest loose cultural influence spreading slowly over generations. But combined with direct physical proof that people were capable of transporting multi-ton stones across the length of the country, the picture shifts considerably. These were not isolated, disconnected tribal groups stumbling into occasional accidental contact. They were part of an active, functioning network, exchanging ideas, techniques, and apparently, in at least one extraordinary case, entire monolithic stones. Researchers now describe this as one of the clearest signs yet that late Neolithic Britain was far more socially and logistically sophisticated than earlier generations of archaeologists ever gave it credit for. This is exactly the kind of finding that becomes even more powerful once you apply large-scale AI analysis to it. A single geological survey can tell you where one stone came from. But Stonehenge is not one stone. It is dozens of massive stones, plus hundreds of smaller features, post holes, cremation burials, pits, and surrounding earthworks, all recorded across more than 300 years of excavation reports written by different researchers using different methods and different terminology. No single human researcher could realistically hold every detail from 3 centuries of fragmented documentation in their head at once. That is precisely the kind of data set an AI system like GROK is built to process, cross-referencing thousands of individual data points simultaneously, looking for connections buried across generations of disconnected research. And when researchers ran the complete body of Stonehenge data through this kind of large-scale analysis, several patterns emerged that reframed the monument's likely purpose entirely. The first major pattern involved timing. Stonehenge is famously aligned with the movement of the sun. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the sun rises directly over what is known as the heel stone, sending a beam of light straight into the heart of the monument. On the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, the alignment works in reverse with the setting sun lining up through the monument's main axis. These solar alignments have been documented and confirmed for decades, but when cross-referenced against the construction timeline, cremation burial dates, and the sequence in which different stones were added or repositioned, a more specific pattern emerged, one suggesting the monument's astronomical function may have been secondary to something even more significant, a coordinated calendar system used to organize seasonal gatherings across widely dispersed communities. It is worth appreciating just how difficult tracking solstice alignments would have been without any written calendar or modern instruments. The people who built Stonehenge had to observe the sun's position along the horizon across many consecutive years, patiently recording where it rose and set during different seasons, long before construction on the stone circle even began. That kind of sustained generational observation implies a level of long-term planning and cultural continuity that goes far beyond a single architect's lifetime. Whoever oversaw this project was almost certainly working from knowledge passed down across multiple generations of careful sky watching. refined and adjusted over decades, before a single sarsen stone was ever set upright, and quite possibly recorded in ways that left no physical trace archaeologists could ever hope to recover. That theory connects directly back to the Scottish origin of the altar stone. If Neolithic Britain genuinely had functioning long-distance networks capable of transporting massive stones across hundreds of miles, then Stonehenge stops looking like a purely local monument built by one isolated community. It starts looking like a deliberate symbolic act of unification, a structure built using material physically sourced from opposite ends of the British Isles, brought together in one place as a powerful statement of connection between otherwise separated groups. Researchers at UCL and Aberystwyth University have already proposed exactly this interpretation following the altar stone discovery, suggesting Stonehenge may have functioned less like a simple temple and more like a monument to unity, a place where early farming communities from across Britain came together, both physically and symbolically, around a shared structure built from pieces of all their homelands. Large-scale pattern analysis adds further weight to this interpretation when you factor in the human remains recovered from the site. Cremated bone fragments have been found buried within the Aubrey holes, a ring of pits that make up part of Stonehenge's earliest construction phase. Isotope analysis conducted on some of these remains suggests certain individuals buried at the site did not spend their entire lives in the immediate area. Some appear to have grown up hundreds of miles away, in regions consistent with parts of Wales, before eventually being buried at Stonehenge after death. That detail lines up almost perfectly with the stone transportation evidence. People were moving across Britain over long distances during this period, and at least some of them ended their lives, quite literally, at the single unifying location. This kind of isotope testing works by examining the chemical signature left behind in bone and tooth enamel, signatures that vary depending on the local water and food sources a person consumed throughout their life. In simple terms, your bones quietly record a chemical diary of where you actually lived, long before you ever set foot anywhere near Stonehenge. When scientists found individuals buried at the site whose chemical signatures did not match the local Salisbury Plain environment, it provided direct physical proof that at least some of the people connected to this monument were travelers, not permanent local residents. Combined with the Scottish origin of the altar stone, this paints an increasingly consistent picture of Stonehenge functioning as a destination, a place people from many different regions specifically traveled toward, rather than a monument built and used exclusively by one static local population. Putting all of these threads together, the stone origins, the burial evidence, the astronomical alignments, and the sheer multi-generational construction timeline, produces a picture very different from the popular image of Stonehenge as some isolated, mysterious temple built by a single vanished culture. Instead, the emerging picture looks more like a deliberately evolving monument, modified and expanded over more than 1,000 years by multiple generations, incorporating material and people from across the length of Britain, likely serving as a central meeting point where seasonal gatherings, ancestor worship, and interregional alliance building all took place simultaneously. None of this fully answers every question, and it is worth being honest about that. We still do not know exactly how a 6-ton stone was moved 750 kilometers using Neolithic technology. Researchers have proposed both overland routes using wooden sledges and rollers, and coastal sea routes using rafts or early boats. But the truth is, nobody living today has definitively reconstructed the method. We also do not know the exact wording of any ceremony performed at the site, since the builders of Stonehenge left behind no writing system at all. Every interpretation of ritual meaning remains, to some degree, an educated reconstruction based on physical evidence rather than direct testimony from the people who built it. Experimental archaeologists have actually attempted to test some of these transportation theories directly, building small-scale sledges and timber tracks to see how many people it would realistically take to drag a multi-ton stone even a short distance. These experiments generally suggest the sarsen stones, moved a relatively short 15 miles, would have required teams of dozens of people working together, along with a huge amount of timber for tracks and rollers. Scaling that same effort up to a 750-kilometer journey, especially if any portion of it crossed open water, pushes the logistics into genuinely staggering territory. It would have required not just labor, but detailed route planning, food supplies for the workforce along the entire journey, and almost certainly some form of cooperation or permission from every community whose land or coastline the stone passed through along the way. Some researchers have even suggested the journey itself, however it was carried out, may have functioned as its own kind of ceremony, a slow, deliberate procession meant to be witnessed and remembered by everyone it passed, rather than a task anyone was trying to complete quickly or quietly. What has changed is the confidence behind these reconstructions. For most of the last century, theories about Stonehenge's purpose ranged wildly, from a solar calendar to a healing site connected to the medicinal properties, long associated with the bluestones, to an ancient astronomical observatory used to predict eclipses, to a simple burial ground for regional elites. Large-scale data analysis has not eliminated any of these theories entirely. Honestly, it does not need to. The most compelling current interpretation is not that Stonehenge served one single narrow purpose, but that it served several overlapping purposes simultaneously, evolving over generations, as the needs and beliefs of the surrounding communities themselves evolved. It may have started as a site, grown into an astronomical marker, and eventually become a symbolic center for uniting geographically distant communities, all across more than 1,000 years of continuous use and reconstruction. This raises the same broader question that keeps surfacing whenever AI gets applied to archaeology at this scale. How much of what we think we know about ancient history is actually limited, not by a lack of physical evidence, but by the sheer difficulty of connecting decades of scattered research conducted by different specialists, working in different decades, often without ever directly comparing notes? Stonehenge alone has generated well over 3 centuries of excavation reports, written across dramatically different eras of archaeological methodology, from 17th century antiquarians literally digging with shovels for personal curiosity, to 21st century scientists extracting individual mineral grains for isotopic dating. Bridging that entire span of research, all at once searching for patterns invisible at any smaller scale, is precisely the kind of task modern AI systems are uniquely positioned to handle. Think about the sheer volume involved here. Hundreds of individual excavation reports, thousands of cataloged stone fragments and bone samples sitting in university collections and museum archives across Britain. Decades of astronomical calculations, isotope readings, radiocarbon dates, and geological surveys, each produced independently, often without full awareness of related findings, published by other teams working the same site in different decades. No individual researcher, no matter how dedicated, could realistically absorb and cross-reference all of that information manually within a single career. That is the exact gap large-scale computational analysis is now beginning to close, not by unearthing brand new physical evidence, but by finally reading everything that already exists, together, all at once. It is worth remembering just how recent some of this really is. The Scottish origin of the altar stone was only confirmed in 2024. That means one of the most fundamental facts about the most famous prehistoric monument on Earth was wrong for over 100 years, corrected only within the last couple of years, using techniques that did not even exist a generation ago. If a fact that basic could remain hidden for a full century, it raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about how many other assumptions scattered across the field of archaeology are still waiting to be quietly overturned the moment somebody finally applies the right tool to the right data set. Stonehenge will likely never give up every one of its secrets. We may never know the exact words spoken during a solstice ceremony 5,000 years ago, or the precise beliefs held by the people who dragged a 6-ton stone across hundreds of miles of unmapped Neolithic terrain. But for the first time in over a century, the story of how this monument came together and why has shifted meaningfully. It has moved away from vague, romanticized mystery and toward a specific, evidence-backed picture of ancient communities working together across enormous distances for a purpose that increasingly looks less like isolated ritual and more like a deliberate act of unification between people who otherwise had every reason to remain strangers to one another. Every stone in that circle now tells a slightly different piece of the same larger story, one that took 5,000 years, 3 centuries of digging, and a handful of years of computational analysis to finally start coming together. If uncovering the real story behind the world's most famous ancient mysteries is something you want more of, go ahead and hit that like button before you leave and stay subscribed out. Because there are plenty more stories exactly like this one still waiting to be dug up.